We get a lot of people here at UnHerd who we admire and think are some of the most interesting brains and thinkers around the world. But the person you're about to hear from, Iain McGilchrist, is definitely one of my favorites. His whole thesis somehow combines science, religion, meaning, and even politics. His whole idea is based on the bi-hemispheric brain, the fact that we have a left brain and a right brain, and they are somehow fundamentally different. And that if people understood that better, a whole load of the conundrums and confusions of life would suddenly be made a lot clearer. He's in conversation this evening with Dr. Philip Goff. They are good friends. He is a professor at Durham University, and they wanted to really have out the question of where consciousness starts, where religion takes over, and what evidence there is around some of Iain McGilchrist's theories for how we should understand that better. It's pretty much the biggest question there could be. I am incredibly proud that we are hosting it here at UnHerd, and because of that, we are going to live stream the first part of it. So the first 15 or 20 minutes will be streamed after this, and after that, we will go back to the room only. So if you want, after you've watched the early part, to come over and join us, then I'm afraid you have to subscribe. So I hope not only because you want to watch the rest of Iain McGilchrist's conversation, but also because you want to support what we're doing and you think free thinking and free inquiry and these kind of big ideas need attention, then head on over to unherd.com/live. We're going to put the link down there. It means that not only can you get the rest of this extraordinary conversation between Iain McGilchrist and Philip Goff, you will also have access to our credible articles, the rest of our live events, our full discussions, commenting, the whole world of UnHerd. We're based in London, but with offices around the world, we are trying to get free inquiry, big picture questions answered and spend time on. So we really hope that we'll see you there.
Welcome, everybody, to this very special evening at the UnHerd Club. There are guests that we have because they are a little bit politically edgy and stimulating. There are people who are humorous or creative, or there are all sorts of different people. And then occasionally there are guests that we have who have such sort of depths of insight and knowledge and have such big ideas that it's just an absolute joy to sit back and hear them speak. And I'm honoured that we've had Dr. Iain McGilchrist here before and that he has chosen to come back for a second time. This evening...
Some people never learn.
You no doubt are familiar with his ideas about the bi-hemispheric brain. As he said, by sitting on the right of the stage, that will mean he was on the right brain as far as the audience is concerned, so I don't know if that's going to make a difference to how you perceive his remarks. This evening, I'm delighted that he will be in conversation with Dr. Philip Goff of Durham University, a panpsychism and philosophy professor, a friend of Iain, author, I must also mention, of both Galileo's Error and Why, the Purpose of the Universe. What we're going to do this evening is tackle these inconsequential questions of consciousness and the divine. What our guests are going to do is have a conversation, just the two of them, for an hour, at which point we'll have dealt with consciousness and the divine, and with great relief we can all go to the bar and get a drink. There'll be a short break, and then we will come back for questions from all of you guys. So please do stick around for that. It will no doubt be a very stimulating evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Iain McGilchrist and Philip Goff.
Thank you. Well, hello, Philip, again.
Hi, Iain.
Hey, yes.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. Well, we've got a couple of things that may detain us for a few minutes this evening.
Just a bit.
And one is the topic of consciousness. And I think I know, that you are a panpsychist, a position that I find very appealing.
Oh, I thought you were going to use a different word then.
No, I'm very much, I think I'd call myself a panpsychist, but I'd like you to talk a little about why you think that is an important approach to the idea of consciousness.
Yeah, it's a good starting point, I think. So, yeah, panpsychism, very roughly, is just the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of the physical universe.
Yes.
So it's a question for physics, what the fundamental building blocks are, but just for the sake of discussion, let's say they're fundamental particles like electrons and quarks. Well, then what the panpsychist thinks is that those fundamental particles have very, very rudimentary forms of conscious experience, and that the very complex consciousness of the human or animal brain is somehow built up from these simpler forms of consciousness right at the base of reality. So it's a bit of a weird sounding view, but I guess part of the reason people are getting more interested in this is and maybe we see eye to eye on this, in a very deep dissatisfaction with the current paradigm on consciousness. You know, we've been trying for several decades now to explain consciousness in terms of physical processes in the brain, and that has gone precisely nowhere. You know, it's not just that we don't have the full story yet, we haven't managed to explain a single experience in terms of patterns of neural firings. And, you know, you might think, oh, we just need to do more brain scans, you know, we're not quite there. You know, it's always this kind of promissory note. But I think, and I think increasingly people are thinking this, you know, when there's a scientific problem that is proving particularly stubborn over a long period of time, sometimes you need to return to the background assumptions.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk to you, but I like to give the analogy of Copernicus, right? The classic analogy. Like before Copernicus, people for a long time, you know, we were starting from the assumption that the Earth is in the center of the universe, and people were trying to make sense of astronomical observations on that basis, and it couldn't be done. It's getting more complicated, epicycles upon epicycles. And then Copernicus sweeps all that away, right? If you start instead from the assumption that the sun is in the center rather than the Earth, suddenly it all makes sense. And I feel that way a little bit about consciousness. We've been trying for so long now, working with the assumption that physical reality is foundational and consciousness sort of pops out of that. We've got nowhere. If you turn that upside down, if you start from consciousness being foundational and try to make sense of physical reality emerging from there, suddenly it all makes sense. That's what I think anyway. What do you think?
No. Well, I agree with you that our attempts to explain consciousness as something that somehow mysteriously is secreted by matter have had absolutely zero success. I think you're absolutely right to stress that it's not as though we've got nearly there, but a little bit more will explain it. In fact, that way of thinking is to make a category mistake, in my view. So, but it's a bit unfair, but you did say, and I know this is a difficult question to answer, that putting together these particles somehow comes to higher levels of consciousness. Can you gloss that a little bit? If a particle has a sort of consciousness, then what's going on as it increases and consciousness becomes more sophisticated and more prevalent, apparently?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think people get a bit confused by it because you're thinking about human consciousness, which is incredibly rich and sophisticated, the result of millions of years of evolution. But consciousness comes in all shapes and sizes, right? The consciousness of a sheep is quite much simpler. Consciousness of a snail, if a snail has experience, is much simpler still. Do bed bugs have experience? And as we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of conscious experience. So the panpsychist view is this keeps on going down to the basics. Fundamental particles having ludicrously simple forms of experience to reflect their very simple physical nature. So it's not like the electrons thinking, is it Tuesday yet? Or, you know, feeling existential angst or something. Just very, again, it's a little bit Copernican maybe, because we're not putting our consciousness at the center of things. Our consciousness is just a highly evolved form of what fills the universe, I think. What do you think?
Yes, and if we come to talk, as I imagine we will at some point, about the issue of whether AI can be conscious, the consideration that we tend to think in terms of our own experience as the sort of the standard whereby we're looking at other things, explains the ease with which people leap to the idea that this system may be conscious.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't entirely, we don't want to go there, I think, immediately. I don't know, happy to go wherever you like, but I think that AI and consciousness, I wouldn't want to dismiss it. I wouldn't want to say this could never happen. But I think that we ought to be very well aware of the fallacious reasoning that allows us to liken things to our consciousness. And I think the word experience is really the best word here.
Yes.
And what's interesting about experience is, perhaps I shouldn't even go there, but the word comes from experiere, which suggests a degree of danger. So the peri bit in experiere is cognate with peril in English and with Gefahr in German. They both come from the same Proto-Indo-European roots. And the idea, I think, there is that experience is fundamentally dangerous in that having it will come to an end, but also that you can't be certain of anything. An issue, I think, extremely important, that any claims of certainty are wrong. I mean, I sometimes say the only thing that's certainly true is that people who say that things are certain are certainly wrong. But in a way, I can't quite avoid this blanket term. But experience is something that is threaded through, and if one uses that instead of the word consciousness, maybe that helps.
I totally agree. We're agreeing too much, aren't we? I think it's a bit of an unfortunate thing that we're stuck with this word consciousness, because people always think of it as something very sophisticated, like awareness of your own existence. You can consciously reflect on your mortality or something. But I don't think a rabbit can do that. But I think a rabbit has experiences. It feels pain if you're cruel enough to stick a knife in it. It feels hot. It feels cold. This is what scientists and philosophers are interested in. We know a lot now, you more than me, about the electrochemical signaling of the brain. We know a lot about the basic chemistry, how chemical signals are sent, how neurons fire. We know what big bits of it do. But where does experience come from? Nothing in the neuroscientific story of the brain seems to have anything to do with feelings and experiences. It's, if aliens came from another planet and looked in our brains, they wouldn't know if we're conscious just from the outside.
No.
In the way we struggle to know if fish are conscious. It's,
I bet they are.
I think they are.
Yeah, I think conscious.
I think everything's conscious.
Yeah, the difficult thing is that when we think we have to explain consciousness, it's different from accepting the existence of consciousness. Now, it does seem to me extraordinary that there are presumably intelligent people occupying university chairs in philosophy who actually deny the existence of consciousness. I mean, to do that at all, they have to have consciousness. And they say it's an illusion, but for it to be an illusion, it has to be an illusion in consciousness. That's what an illusion is. So I don't know what we think about that, but I think it is an extraordinary idea. And for me, the one that we ought to be concentrating on, rather like your Galilean inversion, is what the hell is matter? Why did we decide that it was primary? I mean, very obviously, no human being can deny having a knowing consciousness, but we don't really know what matter is. Nobody has ever seen or experienced matter. They've only had experiences in their consciousness of things that we describe as material.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on the denying consciousness, I spent a week on a boat with Daniel Dennett once travelling around the Arctic.
What did you do to deserve that?
A Russian billionaire wanted to spend some money with a dozen philosophers going around the Arctic on a sailing ship.
Yes.
And Yeah, that was a fun week, and I managed to persuade him he was wrong about something actually. And, but yeah, he was lovely. But yeah, he'd kind of go back and forth. Sometimes he'd say it doesn't exist in his early bolder moves, but then it was more sort of well, we're radically wrong about what it is. Really, it's just behavioural functioning.
Oh gosh, yes. We're back
yeah,
to seeing it from the outside.
Yeah,
behaviorism. I thought we'd put
we
that
can
behind.
believe in consciousness as long as it's just about behaviour, what the brain is doing, what bits of the brain are doing. And my good friend Keith Frankish, who I do a podcast with, is that opinion too. He just thinks so. We both think something's not right with the current paradigm, and I suppose you can go two ways. You can have to say, well, that's because it doesn't exist. You know, it's just like fairy dust or magic or something, or we have to add it to the scientific story. But I mean, your second point fits right in with how the contemporary panpsychist community is thinking of this. We draw inspiration from very important work of Bertrand Russell from the 1920s. I think of Russell as the Darwin of consciousness, actually. I think he sort of sorted out all the mistakes. And so his central insight, which connects with what you were just saying, Ian, is that physics is just pure mathematical structure. Like Stephen Hawking said much later, physics doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations. So as far as physics doesn't really care what's going on at the base of reality. As long as all it cares about is that there's the right mathematical structure. As long as it's got the right mathematical structure, you're going to get physics out of that. So the panpsychist exploits this. And our hypothesis is that what's at the base of reality are very simple conscious entities interacting in simple, predictable ways. Through their interactions, they make certain patterns, certain structures. And then their claim is, those structures just are what we call physics. So we get physics out of this underlying story about consciousness. So I don't think we can get consciousness out of physics. Certainly we've never had any success with that. But I think we can do it the other way around. We know that can be done. Bertrand Russell showed us how to do it. The only problem is it feels a bit weird. But I think that's just a cultural thing, you know. Who was it, the founder of quantum mechanics, who said, science progresses one funeral at a time. You know, it's just... Yeah, actually, the older generation, certain members of the philosophical community have got very, very angry at panpsychism being taken more seriously. You know, it's like, I've been teaching my students this is nonsense for 50 years. But yeah, something's going on.
Despite which, actually, my impression, and you'd know better than I do, is that there are many people in academic philosophy who now do espouse panpsychism. It's become almost commonplace and not at all heretical.
Absolutely. When I studied philosophy in the dying embers of the 20th century, you had two options on consciousness, right? Either you believed in the soul, it was non-physical, or it was just electrochemical signaling. Right? They were your two options. And this is, in the last 10 or 15 years, has really opened up as I guess it's sort of like the Liberal Democrats of... Maybe the Green Party is a bit more cool, isn't it? I don't know. But, you know, this third option, I would say it's still the third option, but it's very much on the table and getting taken more and more seriously. In neuroscience as well, with the integrated information theory, is very close to panpsychism in some ways. So both because of this Bertrand Russell influence in philosophy, you're not too keen on...
Not too keen on IIT. Partly because, like so many things that science does, it describes things at a more basic level that leave things out. And yes, the structure is fine. I don't quarrel with it. But it doesn't really help us get from information to experience.
Oh, yeah.
And this is a theory that effectively says that the subjective experience is identical with the objective observable phenomena. It's just in a very complex system. But why the complexity of a system would suddenly allow you to jump to an entirely different realm, I don't know.
Well, unfortunately, I think I again agree with you. We've got to stop doing this. But yeah, I mean, I think you've got to just the scientific task from the philosophical task. I think the scientific task is to work out which kinds of brain activity go along with consciousness. And I see IIT as trying to do that task. And then the philosophical task, well, why? Why does consciousness have anything to do with brain activity? But actually, I mean, there was a conference recently with the IIT people, and actually, I think you're closer to them than you think. I think sometimes maybe they're not. Maybe scientists are not too clued up on philosophy, and they're expressing something different to how someone with a more philosophical temperament will hear it. But what about AI then? I mean, there's obviously such big discussions on this. I mean, I think future historians are going to look back at this moment something like how we look back in the printing press and the steam engine. You know, I think this technology, for better or worse, is going to revolutionize the world we're living in. But there's maybe in these discussions, there may be less of a focus on these issues we're interested in the nature of the mind. And what do you think? Do you think there are connections?
Well, I think there's certainly connections, but before coming on to the AI question, I think I want to make some reflections on the idea of complexity again, because it always strikes me as like a miracle. You get so complex and it's not conscious, and then suddenly you reach a stage where by a miracle there is consciousness. And I don't think this is likely, and there are various reasons why complexity in itself cannot be the cause of consciousness, because as we know there are 4 times as many neurons in the cerebellum as in the cerebrum, and they're not less connected. They have Purkinje neurons, which are some of the most lavishly ramified neurons in the brain, but the cerebellum cannot sustain consciousness. And you also have, this is familiar ground, hydranencephalic people. This is not the same as hydrocephalus. Hydranencephaly is a condition in which there is effectively no brain. So things stop at the top of the brain stem, which is really what the spinal cord becomes as it goes up towards what we think of as the brain. So there is nothing in the skull after the midbrain, which is this top of the spinal process. And yet the space is filled with fluid, and yet they're able to do many things that seem quite counterintuitive. They can see, they can differentiate faces, they can have friends, they can have favorite toys, they can appreciate music, but they don't have an auditory cortex or a visual cortex. So I think that's important, because it shows us that it's not quite as simple as the idea of just lots of complex things. But it's something to do with the complexity, if you like. If you want to retain the idea of complexity, the way I would do it is by talking about a vast system as a whole, and ultimately the whole universe. I think the whole universe is conscious. I think that consciousness is an ontological primitive. You can't get behind it and find something that causes it. And that is in keeping with the traditions of many cultures, particularly in the East, that consciousness is something primary. But if you think about a stone as is it conscious or not, it's very difficult for us to imagine that it itself is conscious. But what would you say to this idea that it is part of a bigger system, a whole, which is conscious? And so we come to the idea that panpsychism can mean 2 things, or both of them. Either that psyche is in everything, or everything is in psyche. And my way of thinking of it is that everything is in psyche and partakes of its nature. And what matter is a form of psyche that provides 2 very important elements if the universe is to be creative. And I believe the simplest thing that you can observe about the universe, and we find it hard to disagree about, is that it is creative. And for that creativity, you need 2 things that matter gives. resistance and persistence. Without resistance, my thought can go anywhere and there's no form or there's nothing to get purchase on. And without persistence, it comes and goes, but there is nothing that can take part in the unfolding of the panoply of the cosmos. So I see matter as a kind of phase of consciousness that is very important because of persistence and resistance. What do you feel about that?
I liked it. I've got to start disagreeing. Well, look, so I said at the very start of our discussion, it's a job for physicists to tell us what the fundamental things are. And we tend to think of them as particles, little billiard balls. But actually, many theoretical physicists are inclined to think that universe-wide fields are the fundamental things.
Exactly.
And if you combine that with panpsychism, we reach what's sometimes called cosmopsychism.
Yes.
The fundamental thing is the conscious universe. Now, this gets us on to perhaps the other thing I wanted to ask you about, namely God. So you might think this starts to sound a bit like the big guy. But you and I have both been thinking about the big guy a little bit recently, and which isn't incredibly popular in academic circles. But on the other hand, maybe the way we're thinking about God or the transcendent or whatever is a little bit different to the very traditional idea of God. So I'm finding I'm pissing everyone off, actually. So I piss the traditional believers off because they say, that's not the proper God. I piss the atheists off because they, you believe in it to start off with. So what do you think? Would you think of this, if the universe is in some sense conscious, would that be God? Or is there any connection to God? Or are these just entirely different matters?
No, I don't think they're entirely different matters. It's interesting you describe your experience of people getting pissed off with you.
Everybody hates
because when I was writing The Matter with Things, which is an unconscionably long book, I knew I was going to talk about the sacred, and I was having conversations with various philosophers who were reading the book as I was writing it, and they almost all said, but please don't include this chapter on the sacred, because you've done some good philosophical work here that deserves to be read. But if you talk about the sacred, nobody will take you seriously anymore. Anyway, I have a cussed streak in me, and I decided to do it anyway. And I expected to they said you get a little flack from atheists. I haven't had any flack from atheists. I've had flack from Christians who said, why did you not talk more about Christianity? And there's a sort of Christ-shaped hole in your account.
Right.
I can see what they're getting at. But two things. I particularly didn't want to appear to be proselytizing for a particular religion, although I happen to think that the mythos of Christianity is the most rich and deep mythos of any religion in the world. But I also didn't want to seem to be going towards a particular already conceived idea of God. The trouble with the word God is it comes up about 30 pages into the chapter called The Sense of the Sacred, because I didn't want people to be put off and go, oh God, he's a Godhead, But I did want to take very seriously the idea of the divine. And maybe I can just say this briefly. You probably know that I have written a great deal about the difference between the two brain hemispheres. And it seems to me that there are many ways of conceiving God, but the important thing is not to accept the left hemisphere's version of God, which is it must be something that is certain, demonstrable, reproducible, all of that, and that it is like the left hemisphere itself. This God has to be a controlling God who is like a divine engineer who winds up the machine, all this awful 18th century stuff, deism in other words. And I don't see God as remotely like that, and I wanted to get that out of the way fairly early on. What do you think?
Yeah. I like it. No, it's going to be... No, yeah, so, well, I recently came out as a heretical Christian, and it's caused a little bit of heated debate in the philosophical community. There was about 20 reaction videos, and the first wave was from Christians saying I'm not a Christian, and then the second wave was from atheists saying I'd lost my mind. And yeah, a similar... Everyone hates the middle. You know, you want to know what side are you on. It's sort of like team sports, isn't it? What side? But one thing that, you know, one of the things that drew me back to religion actually was rediscovering, or discovering, I should say, the mystical traditions that are found in all the Abrahamic faiths, in Christianity, Islam, Judaism. I think when I was younger, I think I've always been a spiritual person. I think I thought Buddhism is spiritual, you know, Hinduism is spiritual, but Christianity is all about just, you know, doing what the old guy in the sky wants so you get to heaven and that. But actually, for example, how the Eastern Orthodox Church think about Christianity, there is much less emphasis on sin. God isn't interested in finding someone to punish for our sins. That is just not part of, you know, that was invented by the Protestant reformers, right, 500 years ago. That has never been part of the Eastern tradition. The fundamental drive in the Eastern tradition, the fundamental purpose of existence is for God and the universe to become one. God and humanity and the physical universe more generally. So linking back to the cosmopsychist view, I mean, I think this fits quite well with a conscious universe. I mean, if your worldview is that what's at the base of reality is what physics talks about, then it's very hard to make sense of God and the universe becoming one. So you can sort of get the idea of a ghost in a machine or something. It's very hard to make sense of mystical experiences. You're going to think they're just sort of something going wrong with your brain or something. But if you already think the universe is pervaded by consciousness, if you already think the universe is a conscious entity of some kind, then the idea of God and the universe becoming one starts to make a lot more sense. So I don't think the universe is God, but I think it makes more sense of this mystical understanding of God. Sounds a bit kind of hippie-ish, sounds a bit, you know, or what's this new? But that is just Orthodox Christianity, how it has always been. And so, you know, this found version of Christianity that sort of deeply resonated with me on a spiritual level, but also fits with the panpsychist view, I think, has independent support. So, yeah, I think there's, again... But I'm starting to feel there is a greater openness to these things. Things are slowly changing.
I find there's a parallel between what I think we both, if I'm speaking for you wrongly, you must say, but what we both think about psyche and panpsychism, and my view about God, which is effectively panentheistic, which is entirely coherent with Christianity. Many Christians are panentheists. The idea of panentheism, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, is it's distinct from pantheism, which is the idea that the sum of everything is God, and God is just everything that exists. Panentheism recognizes that God can't be limited in this way, but that everything exists in God, and that God is, in some sense, in everything. This is very like my feeling about the pervasive psyche, and it may be no coincidence that it has that structure. What I'd want to say is, you said, I don't think that God just is the universe, and I would agree with that for the reasons I've just said, apart from anything else. But I'd also say that I take the view that everything is in process, everything is becoming, nothing is final, and that even God, in a sense, is discovering the potential that is within him. I have to use the word him because it is no good.
They?
No.
God's non-binary.
No, I don't want to go into
I said that on
the
Twitter.
ghastly pronouns conversation. No, sorry.
Dropped a bit of a bomb on Twitter saying
No.
God's non-binary, right?
Anyway,
Trinity.
let's just pass over it because it's tedious. It's extremely uninteresting.
I had a debate with very traditional Christian philosopher William Lane Craig recently, and yes, I did use the she pronoun in my why book, and he was she. He was a bit close. Anyway, we can move on. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a bit of a sidetrack, but but whatever it is, whatever it is not referable in that third person way, because I believe that whatever it is in deep connection with the creation, and that therefore our relationship is an I-thou relationship. It is a resonant relationship. And I haven't got time to unpack this, but I have done in my writing that I believe there's a sort of echo on my microphone, isn't there? Does that matter? No, okay. Is that forgotten what I was going to say. That there's yes, that everything that exists that we can know and experience exists in the relationship between an individual consciousness and something that is other than that consciousness. And that this process is a resonant one in which each alters the other, each has an effect on the other. And turning that's a whole, half a book in itself, but that's the conclusion I come to. So that everything is resonant and interactive and coming into being between two entities. The two-ness is important, but they are also one in the sense that there's not just the objective and the subjective in a dualistic way. They are distinguishable, but not wholly distinct or divided. And that's a distinction we're not used to making in the modern world. We tend to think that if we can make a distinction, it implies a division. But importantly, it doesn't. And what is apparently distinct goes through phases of being more united and more unpacked into diversity. Goethe has this wonderful saying that dividing the united, uniting the divided is the whole work of nature. And I see this as a very important reciprocal motion. Now, what this is leading up to is a Whiteheadian view of God and the cosmos, that they are engaged in, if you like, a cosmic dance in which the ground of being is coming to experience all that is implied within it, the unfolding of the implicit order into something explicit. But then that explicitness is enfolded again into another implicit whole that is greater than it. And you find this in Nicholas of Cusa, and you find it through a number of modern thinkers, but the most important one, I think, is Whitehead. We have never talked about this. What do you feel about that?
I'm very sympathetic. I'm very influenced by both process philosophy and process theology. I don't always buy all the details of Whitehead's view. So it's people who are into Whitehead, sometimes you have to get all the exact details, but I do feel an intellectual kinship. But actually, for the book I'm working on at the moment, sort of reimagining religion for the 21st century and exploring the mystical traditions. And what you just said to me reminded me of Meister Eckhart, the great Christian mystic from, 11th, 12th century? I can't remember now.
14th
And
century.
as I interpret him, yes, you're right, it's a bit later. Ibn Arabi, the Sufi mystic, I think is 11th century, who, let's start with Eckhart. So as I interpret Eckhart, I think there's a sort of overlap between God and the universe, like a sort of Venn diagram. So there's sort of part of us that's not God, there's part of God that's not us, but there is something in common. There is an aspect of us that is identical with an aspect of God. He was tried for heresy, and, but he said he had an interesting response. He seems like a lovely character when you read. He seems very modern as well when you read. Often with mystics, they feel very modern. And But he says, he distinguished heresy and error. He said, heresy is willful, error is a mistake, and if you show me I'm in error, I will recant, so I can't be a heretic. He died before the trial was finished.
Yes.
But the Pope at the time said afterwards he was in error. So on that basis. But Ibn Arabi, so the Sufi mystic who, thought that ultimate reality, even Allah, is not God. Sounds a bit odd for a Muslim, but even Allah is our way of relating to ultimate reality. And he thought ultimate reality is, by definition, unknowable, because to know something is to make it the object of thought, to limit it, to qualify it, but ultimate reality is totally unknowable. So, and I think that the panentheistic view does seem to make sense of some of these mystical things you get in all religions, but to find it in a Christian form and to make sense of that oneness. But I think I think there's been kind of head and heart reasons behind my return to thinking about religion. So I suppose what we've just been talking about is that more the heart stuff, this kind of way of understanding Christianity as a mystical tradition. But in terms of the head stuff, I think I've just slowly come to think that both sides of this never-ending... Is my mic all right? I think it keeps going off. No, is it just my... I've slowly come to think that both sides of this never-ending debate between theism and atheism, both sides have something right and something wrong. You know, so it's always, it just goes on and on. It's like team sports. You know, it's like, whose side are you on, Richard Dawkins or the Pope? Choose your team. Yeah. But I think they both have things they can't explain.
Well, that's
right.
Good.
I think, you know, traditional theism can't explain the horrific suffering we find in the world. Why would a loving God who can do anything choose to allow such horrific suffering? Whereas I think there's also things traditional atheism can't explain, like the fine-tuning of physics for life, this surprising discovery of recent decades that for life to be possible, certain numbers in physics have to fall in an incredibly narrow range, such that it's just astronomically improbable that we would have got the right numbers for life just by chance. So both sides have something to explain. What we're neglecting is the middle ground options. So this is what, turned into my most recent book, modestly titled, Why the Purpose of the Universe. Just exploring these middle way options. And just finally, the one I've become attracted to, for example, which I think fits with panentheism, is a God of limited power. So a God who's all-powerful, other way around, a God who's perfectly good, but just not all-powerful. I think this can be actually quite precisely articulated and can elegantly account for both the fine-tuning in physics in terms of God's purposes and the suffering we find in terms of God's limitations. And so I really think this is where the evidence is, and I also think it fits quite well with Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So that was the final thing of the head and the heart coming together. Not that the Eastern Orthodox believe in a God of limited power, but fits well with their core mystical conception of things. Yeah. Anyway, that was a bit long.
If you have been enjoying this conversation live this evening between Iain McGilchrist, the incredible thinker, real groundbreaking thinker, and Dr. Philip Goff, his good friend at the UnHerd Club in London. And if you would like to see the rest of it, please head on over to unherd.com/live. We have a special offer for you. And not only will you be able to watch the rest of this really important conversation, you can stay around for the Q&A section afterwards, but crucially, you will have access to the whole world of UnHerd. So head on over. It's less than you would spend at Starbucks. And guess what? It will keep you awake even longer. Hope to see you there.